When thinking about American history, the Civil War of 1861 to 1865 is bound to come to mind. The country was born out of the Revolution of 1776 to 1783. Yet, its character was shaped by the Civil War, which determined whether the U.S., born of a declaration that all men are created with an equal right to liberty, would continue to exist as the largest slaveholding country in the world. And secondly, whether it was to be a dissolvable confederation of sovereign states or an indivisible nation with a sovereign national government. In the middle of the 19th century, the United States was going through a period of tremendous economic expansion. Nonetheless, there was a fundamental economic disparity between the northern and southern portions of the country. The economy of the North was based on manufacturing and industry, and agriculture was primarily limited to small-scale farms. In contrast, the economy of the South was based on a system of large-scale farming that relied on the labor of black enslaved people to grow certain crops, particularly cotton and tobacco. Growing abolitionist sentiment in the North after the 1830s, as well as Northern opposition to the extension of slavery into the new Western territories, caused many people in the South to fear that the institution of slavery in the United States, and therefore the economic foundation of their region, was in jeopardy. Nonetheless, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, enacted by the United States Congress in 1854, essentially legalized the practice of slavery in all newly acquired territories by establishing that popular sovereignty takes precedence over congressional edict. Both pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces engaged in it, bleeding Kansas, and concurrently, opposition to the act in the North resulted in the establishment of the Republican Party, a new political entity founded on the principle of opposing the expansion of slavery into the Western territories. After the Supreme Court's decision in the Dred Scott case, 1857, confirmed the legality of slavery, the abolitionist John Brown's raid at Harper's Ferry in 1859 convinced more and more Southerners that their northern neighbors were intent on destroying the peculiar institution that sustained them. The election of Abraham Lincoln in November 1860 was the final straw, and within 3 months, 7 southern states, South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, seceded from the U.S. Even as Lincoln was taking office in March 1861, Confederate soldiers posed a threat to the federal garrison at Fort Sumter, which was located in Charleston, South Carolina. When Lincoln had ordered a fleet to resupply Fort Sumter on April 12, the first shots of the Civil War were fired by rebel artillery. This marked the beginning of the war after less than 2 days of bombardment. Fort Sumter's commander, Major Robert Anderson, surrendered, leaving the fort in the hands of Confederate forces under the direction of Pierre G.T. Beauregard. After Fort Sumter, the Confederacy expanded to include 4 additional southern states: Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee. Although the border slave states like Missouri, Kentucky, and Maryland did not secede, there was a significant amount of Confederate sympathies among the residents of those states. Although the Civil War may have appeared to be a one-sided conflict on the surface, with the 23 states of the Union enjoying an enormous advantage in population, manufacturing including the production of arms and the construction of railroads, the Confederates had a strong military tradition, along with some of the best soldiers and commanders in the nation. They were fighting for a cause that they strongly believed in, which was the maintenance of their time-honored customs and institutions, the most important of which was slavery. In the First Battle of Bull Run, also known in the South as First Manassas, which took place on July 21, 1861, 35,000 Confederate soldiers, led by Thomas Jonathan "Stonewall" Jackson, forced a greater number of Union forces, or the Federals, to retreat towards Washington, D.C. This prompted Abraham Lincoln to call for 500,000 more soldiers to join the fight. Actually, the initial calls for troops that were made by both sides had to be expanded as it became apparent that the war would not be brief. George B. McClellan, who succeeded the aged General Winfield Scott as the supreme commander of the Union Army after the opening months of the war, was admired by his soldiers. But President Abraham Lincoln was disappointed by his unwillingness to advance. In the spring of 1862, General George B. McClellan ultimately pushed his Army of the Potomac across the peninsula that is located between the York and James Rivers, and they were successful in taking Yorktown on May 4. However, the combined armies of Robert E. Lee and Jackson were effective in driving McClellan's army back during the 7 days battles, and a cautious McClellan sought even more reinforcements to advance against Richmond. Lincoln declined, and as a substitute, he brought the Army of the Potomac back to Washington. In the middle of 1862, Henry W. Halleck succeeded McClellan as the General-in-Chief of the Union armies, while McClellan continued to lead the Army of the Potomac. After that, Lee shifted his forces to the north and divided his army, sending Jackson to meet Pope's forces near Manassas, while Lee himself proceeded separately with the second half of the army. During the Second Battle of Bull Run, which took place on August 29, Union troops led by John Pope engaged Jackson's men, and the following day, General Lee launched a tremendous assault against the Federal left flank, which drove Pope's forces back into Washington. Following his triumph at Manassas, Lee initiated the first Confederate invasion of the northern states. Despite receiving contradictory orders from both Lincoln and Halleck, McClellan reorganized his army and launched an attack against Lee on September 14 in Maryland. As a result, the Confederates were forced to retreat to a defensive position along Antietam Creek, located near Sharpsburg. On September 17, Lee's men, which had been reinforced by Jackson's, were attacked by the Army of the Potomac in what became the deadliest single day of action during the whole conflict. During the Battle of Antietam, 12,410 of approximately 69,000 Union forces and around 13,724 of approximately 52,000 Confederate troops were killed. This Union victory halted the Confederate progress in Maryland and forced Lee to retreat into Virginia. But McClellan's inability to capitalize on his advantage brought him the disapproval of both Lincoln and Halleck, who ultimately decided to remove him from command in favor of Ambrose E. Burnside. Burnside's attack on Lee's troops near Fredericksburg on December 13 resulted in heavy Union casualties and a Confederate victory, and so he was promptly replaced by Joseph Fighting Joe Booker. After the Emancipation Proclamation, 1863-4, Lincoln used the occasion of the Union victory at Antietam to issue a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, which emancipated all enslaved individuals in the rebellious states after January 1, 1863. He used the war as an excuse for his choice, but he did not go as far as to free the enslaved people who lived in the border states that remained loyal to the Union. Yet, the Emancipation Proclamation removed the vast majority of the Confederacy's available workforce and swung public sentiment decisively in favor of the Union. By the time the Civil War came to a conclusion in 1865, around 186,000 black troops were serving in the Union Army, and of those, 38,000 were killed in action. Booker's intentions for an onslaught by the Union were foiled in the spring of 1863 when the majority of Lee's forces launched a surprise attack on May 1. Booker withdrew his men to the safety of Chancellorsville, where the Confederates emerged victorious. A second invasion of the North was prompted by Lee in June, and on July 1 in Gettysburg, he attacked the Union forces which were under the leadership of General George Meade. During 3 days of intense fighting, the Confederates were unable to break through the Union center and suffered casualties close to 60%. During the same month, Union forces led by Ulysses S. Grant captured Vicksburg, and this victory would prove to be the turning point of the war in the Western Theater. After a Confederate victory at Chickamauga Creek, Georgia, in September, Lincoln expanded Grant's command, and he led a reinforced Federal army to victory in the Battle of Chattanooga in late November. In March of 1864, Abraham Lincoln removed Halleck from his position as Supreme Commander of the Union Army and replaced him with Grant. Grant, while leaving William Tecumseh Sherman in control in the West, traveled to Washington, where he led the Army of the Potomac towards Lee's men located in northern Virginia. Even though the Union suffered heavy casualties in the Battle of the Wilderness and at Spotsylvania, both of which took place in May 1864, at Cold Harbor early in June, and at the key rail center of Petersburg in the same month, Grant continued to pursue a strategy of attrition and placed Petersburg under siege for the next 9 months. Sherman outmaneuvered Confederate forces to capture Atlanta by the end of September, and afterwards led approximately 60,000 Union troops on the infamous March to the Sea, which ravaged Georgia on the way to capture Savannah on December 21. Sherman's forces also had taken control of Columbia and Charleston, South Carolina, by the middle of February, and when the Confederate war effort was on its last legs, Jefferson Davis belatedly handed over the leadership to General Robert E. Lee. Sherman continued to advance across North Carolina, eventually conquering Fayetteville, Bentonville, Goldsboro, and Raleigh by the middle of April. In the meantime, Lee's men, which were depleted by the Union siege of Petersburg and Richmond, made one final attempt at resistance by seizing control of Fort Stedman on March 25. An instant counterattack was able to reverse the triumph, and on the night of April 2–3, Lee's soldiers were forced to evacuate Richmond. Grant and Meade gave chase to the fleeing Confederates along the Appomattox River for the better part of the following week, eventually depriving them of any remaining options for evasion. Finally, at the Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, Grant accepted Lee's surrender. Nonetheless, this was not the end, for John Wilkes Booth, an actor and Southern sympathizer, shot and killed President Abraham Lincoln at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. on April 14. On April 26, Sherman received Johnston's surrender at Durham Station, and this was what effectively brought an end to the war. The Civil War solidified the United States as a unified political entity, emancipated more than 4 million slaves, strengthened and centralized federal authority, and set the stage for the United States' rise to global prominence in the 20th century. Even though emancipation did not automatically result in full equality, the Civil War did usher in monumental constitutional reforms that forever altered the character of American society and marked a turning point in the fight for full recognition of all citizens' civil and human rights. This brings us to the end of this video. If you liked the video, please consider subscribing and sharing so we can keep bringing more content like this. See you next time.